A big thank you to the Talk Python team who sponsor this episode of the podcast. If you want to get better at Python, now is an excellent time to take an online course. Whether you are just learning Python to delve into great topics like artificial intelligence, or you need to go deep into things like APIs and async, my friends at Talk Python Training have a top-notch course for you. Visit talkpython.fm/mind to find your next level and get a 10% discount. Also a big thank you to all my Patreons who support the Engineered Mind podcast. Hi and welcome to the second season of the Engineered Mind podcast. In this podcast we cover topics such as engineering, artificial intelligence, neuroscience and other interesting topics to educate, inspire and engineer people's minds all around the world. I'm your host Joseph, and for this podcast I welcome Jim Cantrell, former Vice President of Business Development at SpaceX and founder of several entrepreneurial startups, including Vector Launch, Stratspace and Vintage Exotics Competition Engineering. Jim's career also includes assignments at the French Space Agency, the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, and has resulted in experience in over 46 satellite flight missions, including the Iridium Next space telephone system. He is a world-recognized technical innovator and has received numerous professional awards. He has pioneered the concepts of software-defined satellites, micro-launch vehicles, and space situational awareness sensors. In this podcast, Jim will not only talk about the aerospace industry and his passion of racing cars and what you can learn about life from it, but also what it is like to work with Elon Musk and why he decided to stop working on the SpaceX project. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's my conversation with Jim Cantrell. Jim Cantrell, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on my show. Welcome, first of all.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Usually we kick things off with giving us a 1-minute bio, but I want to change it a little bit differently because you have done so much and 1 minute would be a bit too less. So I want to start the podcast with a quote from Garth Stein from his great novel, The Art of Racing in the Rain, which says, "A winner, a champion will accept his fate. He will continue with his wheels in the dirt. He will do his best to maintain his line and gradually get himself back on the track when he is safe to do so. He loses a few places in the race. Yes, he is at a disadvantage, but he is a winner, a champion, and will accept his fate. He is still racing, he is still alive." Now, taking this to space exploration and building rockets, how did you take this complex idea as one of the co-founders from SpaceX and take such a complex problem and divide and conquer it, basically?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's we have a phrase. We say start in the lower left-hand corner of the problem, and you take it one step at a time. Really, it's so big, you have to break it down into sizes and chunks that are something you can solve individually. It's like any complex problem, and I can tell you 20 years ago when we were first starting on this enterprise, it's now called SpaceX, our goals were much more modest than what they've achieved already. So, in the beginning, it was enough to just say, we wanted to build a private launch vehicle that could send satellites into space. Nobody had ever done that. And there was enough people that thought we were insane wanting to do that, that you didn't dare think much bigger, even though Elon was thinking much bigger. He was already thinking about Mars bases back then. So, here we see SpaceX launching humans into space, and it's really a product of a lot of dedication of a lot of people for a lot of years.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Now you also mentioned Elon. How was it working with him, and how did he approach you back then?
Well, let me just start with how he approached me, and then I can give you some insight on working with him. It was really a cold call on Elon's part to me back in July I believe it was July 14th of 2001. And the world was a different place at that point. That was pre 9/11, the attacks in New York City and Washington. And, it was kind of a peaceful, almost kind of lazy atmosphere at that time. And there were a lot of internet billionaires and millionaires that wanted to do things in space. So it was not all that unusual that I would get a call out of the blue from some of these people with money that wanted to do things in space. I had this, strangely, a reputation of being able to help them. So Elon Musk called me one Friday afternoon while I was on my way home from work, and it was a 650 area code, which is Palo Alto. So I answered it. I wouldn't normally answer it, and he began speaking very staccato. It was, very fast, very rapid. He had it all planned out in his head, at least. And something about an internet billionaire and private space and wanting to go to Mars, and wanted to talk to me about Russian rockets. And so, I had the top down on the car, and I said, listen, I'm almost home. I'll call you when I get home. He said, yeah, that's fine. So I got home, said hello to the kids, and went into my office, called that number back, and it was a fax machine. And fax machines are getting rare anymore, but they have this characteristic long squealing beep that's very unpleasant to listen to. And so I hung up the phone and thought, okay, he called me from a fax machine. So, didn't know if he was real or not. I didn't know who Elon Musk was. I thought he said Ian Musk, different name slightly. The accent was funny. I couldn't quite understand him. He was South African, but I didn't know that at the time. And then about, maybe 20 minutes later, I get a call back from him, and it's a different number, and he's pretty irritated, and he says, hey, you didn't call me back, and wondered if something's wrong. And I said, well, I called your fax machine. And he said, oh yeah, okay. I do that to keep people from knowing my cell phone number. This is my cell phone number, and this is really important. And I want to make humanity a multiplanetary species, and we want to do this mission to Mars to inspire humanity, and I need your help finding Russian rockets because I can't afford them. U.S. rockets are too expensive. And I said, yeah, sure, I can talk to you. And he said, great. Where do you live? In the Northern Rockies, and small town. And he said, oh, do you have an airport there? And I said, yeah, I can see it from my house. He says, great. I have a private airplane. I'll be there tomorrow. And I'm thinking, no, you're not coming to my house. I don't know who you are. And I hadn't had a chance to do anything. So he talked to me about this thing called PayPal, which I thought was a funny name. And so anyhow, I said, look, we're flying out of Salt Lake City on commercial on Sunday. So why don't we just meet behind security? You can fly in and I'll meet you there. So we went ahead and met there. And the reason I did that is because I knew he couldn't carry a weapon. He couldn't get that through security, and that there were police nearby in case it was a wacko. So, that's literally how I, treated this in the beginning. And, as I researched him, I quickly found out he's the real deal. And this PayPal thing, I began to understand a little bit that it was kind of a revolutionary way to transfer money. And again, this was a different era. This was a long time ago. So it seems kind of funny, but it was, I was pretty tech savvy at the time, and even I hadn't heard of these things. So we met, and it was pretty clear that he had this idea in mind, and he was going to spend some money on it. And so I agreed to help him. And so that's what led us to put together a team of people to look at this Mars mission. And we ended up convincing him to go with something that we called Mars Oasis, which was going to grow a plant on the surface of Mars rather than send mice to Mars. And in order to do that, we needed a fairly large rocket. And we identified there were 2 Russian vehicles that would work. And because of my connections in the former Soviet Union, I made the arrangements, and we went over there a couple of times, unsuccessful in being able to buy the rockets. And so on the last trip over, after we finished, on our way back, he announced to me and Mike Griffin, who later became the NASA administrator, by the way, that we were going to build this rocket ourselves. So, Mike and I were pretty surprised by that, and come to find out he'd been working with this team, some of which were amateur rocket type people, and they'd come up with a pretty good design for the Falcon 1. So that's how SpaceX started. Elon, it's very illustrative of Elon's sort of personality, very urgent. Everything's now. And then that's all good. When you're an entrepreneur, the best time is now for anything, whatever it is that needs to be done, you do it now. And you don't wait. There's not much else in your life besides this this idea you have or this objective you have. And so Elon's all about that. So he's, anybody that can stay with him has to be 100% with Elon. You can't be 5% for anything else in your life. It has to be 100% Elon. So this presents problems for some people. Like me, I had a family and I didn't really want to live in Los Angeles. I grew up there. That's where we put SpaceX. And, he also had this habit of yelling, and he had a temper that was pretty substantial. He yelled at me probably one too many times, and I got tired of that. But more importantly, I realized that, I wasn't really 100% with Elon, and he really deserved. I came to admire the man, and I realized he really deserved that 100% dedication from anybody that was with him, because he, of all people, dedicated 100% of his life to what he was doing. So I decided to part company with him about 2 years into our relationship. And, we had a better relationship once I left than when I was working for him. It had changed when I went from being a consultant to an employee. And then it went back to the relationship I always liked when I left. But eventually he and I had disagreements over things like Tesla that we've quit talking over the years.
Got it. And you have been the vice president of business development when you worked for SpaceX, right? You were responsible for the supply chain, sales, development, and so on.
Yeah. I also got involved in some of the design of the rockets. At that early stage, I think we were 15 people, and you did a little bit of everything. I got involved in the turbo pump design. I got involved in the tank design, some of the recovery systems. And so we, when you're vice president of business development, there's not much to sell in the early days. So he just assigned me, various things to do, plus going out and finding the vendors.
You worked on the Falcon 1 and Falcon 5, as far as I'm correct, right?
Yeah. So what we did in the early days, the Falcon 1 was, sort of the initial minimum viable rocket, as we looked at it. And, I did the assessment of, what size rocket would make economic sense. And, Elon was good with me doing that assessment. And the Falcon 5 is what I came up with, which was essentially a Delta II replacement. And that market was very well proven. And the answer to this was really funny to me. I presented it to Elon as the fastest return on investment of all the rockets we could build. And then it didn't make sense to go through the Falcon 1. And his answer was, I don't really care about return on investment. So he obviously had other things in mind. And whether the Falcon 1 was a mistake or not is kind of something you could debate. I don't believe it was. There was a big market, still is, for the small launchers. But for him, it was a technical stepping stone, because if you look at the history of it, they had one successful commercial flight on Falcon 1, then they discontinued it. And I know for a fact there were lots of orders behind that, because I was in the process of negotiating buying about 5 of them for a startup company called Skybox. So they quickly moved to the Falcon 9 and dropped the Falcon 5. The Falcon 5 was not on this path to what I believe is the ultimate objective, which is Mars. And I think that's always been the objective of SpaceX ultimately.
You also talked about that you visited the Russians and you speak 4 languages, if I'm correct. One of them is Russian.
Yeah, I used to be better at it than I am now. It's been 20 years.
Yeah, but back then when you approached the Russian chief designer, as far as I remember, is it true that one of them spat on you, like you and Elon, because he was feeling kind of disrespected from Elon, maybe?
Yeah, it was the chief designer of a company called Machina Stroya. Now, all these companies are all state owned, and it's important to understand in the Russian aerospace industry, rather than having a CEO like we do in the West, who's rather considered the leader of the organization, there it's the chief designer. So this goes back, I guess, to the Soviet system. And any of these groups were headed by a technical chief designer. So Chilome was the head of one at Energia years ago, and you hear about Korolev and some of these guys. That's the kind of culture. So these are exalted, very bright, very competent people that run the organization. So this is the one we were meeting with at Machinistроя, and they had built what amounted to weapons of war. So the Strela, which we were talking to them about, was a converted ICBM. And I suspect that this gentleman's frustration, I don't remember his name anymore, was born both out of, a recognition that nobody in the Soviet Union was really happy about what had happened when the Soviet Union came apart. And also, here's a young, you got to remember, Elon was 29 years old when we went to Russia. And it's a very, it's a very paternalistic culture in the sense that age really does matter. And, I was in my late 30s, early 40s, as I recall. And let me see, it would have been mid to late 30s. So, I was still pretty young, but Elon was especially young, and he was the man with all the money. So I really honestly believe that they just found this whole thing ridiculous. As I said, we were talking about building rockets ourselves. Here's a man coming in and saying he wants to spend all this money of his own to send a plant to Mars, which made no sense to the Russians. And I just think it was overwhelming for the guy. That was the sense I got. And he did. As we were explaining it to him, he spit on our shoes. And Elon turned to me and said, "I think you spit on me." And I said, "Yeah, I think that's a sign of disrespect." So that was when the meeting was pretty much over at that point. So yeah, it's a true story.
Mm-hmm. How do you see it when you look back? Was it the kind of disrespect they gave Elon, but also other people saying it's not possible to do what he tried to do, that he kept pushing?
Yeah, it was not Elon specific by any means. He's the only one that actually made it through. One of the comments that Mike Griffin and I gave to Elon on the airplane when he turned to us and said, "Look, I think we can make this rocket ourselves," is, I can't remember if Mike or I said it, but one of us said there's a whole graveyard of dead bodies out in front of you to step over. The people have tried to do this before. There was a guy named Andrew Beal who was a banker in Texas. And by the time he spent $100 million trying to do this several years prior to Elon, he went bankrupt. And as it turns out, the test site in Waco, Texas is Andrew Beal's old test site. So, when I when I went looking for test sites, I remembered that. And so I called up the city of McGregor, Texas, and asked them if they still had the test site. And of course they did. So we stepped into that. But, the reality was you just didn't do these things. And it was considered a government domain that nobody dared to step into. And it's hard to really put your mind back in that from where we are today, because it looks so easy. It looks so easy what SpaceX is doing. It's not. And to say that, you and your little private army of smart kids are going to do this was crazy speak back then. And so in that sense, if you want to look around the world right now and think of something that should make you smile, this should make you smile. This is good news. This means that, we are making not only technical progress, we're making human progress, that people can have a dream, they can have an idea, and they can make it a reality without getting the permission of the entire society. And, Elon is really a transformative figure that way. And he had just enough grit to get through it. And he almost didn't get through it. He'll tell you the story, or you can read it in the book, about how they were down to their last Falcon 1. And had it not worked, they were going to be out. In fact, he was out of money personally. He went through a devastating divorce with his wife, Justine. I knew Justine fairly well. And, I've been through a divorce myself. I understand how this works. And, we ended up with... he ended up with no money at one Christmas, and he stuck through it. Though he never gave up, and it's like your first quote that you started with. That's the racer's creed. You I've hit the walls in races. You go back, you fix the car, you start over. I've spun. You just can't give up. And life is like that, and being an entrepreneur is like that even more.
Hmm. Now, a very important question is, now that I see the books behind you, did Elon ever return the books to you?
No,
Still
no,
not okay.
no. I
Maybe he
love
sees
my
the
books.
yeah, yeah. Maybe he sees the podcast. Let's see if I put it on Twitter and maybe he reacts to it. And Elon, if you hear this, please give Jim back his books.
No, it's okay.
That's fine.
Keep the books. I've long ago replaced them.
That's okay. Um,
I'm happy to contribute to the knowledge base of the world.
that's so cool. Speaking of books, what books in particular would you recommend if somebody is very inspired by the podcast or maybe what Elon does, if they want to go into the rocket science business?
Yeah, rockets. It's kind of an interesting technical field, but I think it's actually more of an interesting human field. So, there's books on some of the early efforts, by Lockheed, and in the aircraft industry and the Skunk Works. Those are interesting stories to read, even though they're back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Reading about Kelly Johnson and some of his exploits is really interesting. Korolev, there's some books on Korolev, who was the Soviet chief designer that got what amounted to the Soyuz rockets flying, and just the sort of things they went through to get to that point. Very, very interesting. So, um, you know, I personally, I like the human side of the story, and then I helped Ashley broker the book about Elon. With Elon. At that time, Elon was very much against having anybody write anything about him. And Ashley was also a South African, and he called me out of the blue and just wanted to interview me about it, kind of like you. But he was one of the first people who was really interested in this story. And, I didn't really realize that this story was interesting until, time went on. And at the time, when we were doing it seemed like an interesting thing I might tell my grandkids about, but I never thought of it as a historical sort of thing. But Ashley did a really nice job capturing this whole story of SpaceX, and he'll talk about some of the things I just told you. And the nice thing about Ashley is he was skeptical, and he went back. He even checked my passports, so he checked the story out completely. And I sent him copies of my passports, and he pawed through the copies and found the date stamps and all that stuff. And he verified the story, which was kind of cool. But those are really the places to start if you're interested in, there's a number of books on the history of liquid rocket engines. There's a lot of books like Sutton's Propulsion was the one Elon borrowed from me. Bates and Mueller Astrodynamics was the orbital book. So those are good seminal kind of books if you're interested in the technical side.
Mm-hmm. We'll maybe get back to Elon at a later point of this podcast. I want to ask you personally, what keeps you awake at night? Is it rockets or is it something else?
It's a good question. It depends on the day. I go sort of between challenges of professional nature and challenges of racing cars, which is one of my great passions in life. And then concern about my family. I have 6 kids, so I have plenty to worry about. So sometimes they keep me awake at night. Sometimes it's, the race cars and, what I'm going to do next. It's usually more of a problem of opportunity with race cars because there's more races than there's time and money to chase. And, with businesses, there's always something to worry about. And I just started a new company called Phantom Space and doing very well. But it's something that we've taken a different attitude about and, listening to the market a little bit more and trying less to force through a notion kind of like Elon did with SpaceX. And we're having great success at that, actually. So despite, this worldwide pandemic that we're facing, we've been able to raise money and we've gotten contracts and become cash flow positive by building satellites. And so it's, it's one of these things that you have to sort of listen to the wind, if you will, which way is it going? And, and you have to react to what's really happening. So when you don't do that, it seems like businesses are sometimes very, very difficult. And we just got done talking about Elon and how, SpaceX really persevered with this vision. That's one way to do it, but those tend to be, one in 10,000 kinds of successes, and so you've got to make your choices.
Hmm. It's good that you mentioned successes now. What do you think? What are the ingredients of success? Is it mainly money or intelligence, or is it like a combination of value creation and other things?
Now, the reason I smiled so much with your original quote, it's just that it's just never giving up,
Hmm.
and you have to have a certain amount of intelligence to do what you do, and some things require a little more intelligence than others. But by and large, the more important thing is just a determination to do what you want to do, and that's the number one thing. The second thing is that what you want to do, you have to be good at, and not everybody chooses those things. We all know the person that wants to play football that's no good, or I see them out on the racetrack, and a lot of times people have more money than talent in a race car, and that's a bad combination, because we start to see very fast cars with very little talent, and we spot them right away. We're an insolent bunch that drive race cars in very small society, and can spot the guys that come in from the outside right away. So there's that, and then the third thing is people have to want to buy whatever it is you're doing, because you do have to have an economic motive, to consider success, unless your definition of success is outside the entrepreneurial world, which is fine. But generally, it has to be something that there's some demand for.
Hmm.
And what you don't really focus on for success is money. And it's funny that people who think about nothing but money really really don't become successful. They become focused on the money, and that's too bad, because that's really not where the success is. Money is a reflection of the value you create, and it's not really a goal. And I've never. This has been a weakness and a strength, I guess. I've never been really concerned about money in my life. I've made plenty of it, but it's not been my goal. And when I go, I don't know what my kids are going to do with it, but hopefully they'll do something. But if you earn so much money and you leave it behind, what does it matter?
Hmm. It's so cool that you said that, Jim, because I'm thinking the same way like you. So that's very great to hear it from you. Um, Also, you talked about racing, which you're very passionate about, and I read on your blog 5 things that you learned from racing, which is very interesting. Do you want to go over them if you have them in mind, or?
Sure. Yeah, I can hit the highlights. First, as we've been talking about, which is never, ever, ever give up. And in a race, I've been in many of these endurance races, which can go from 2 hours to 25 hours, depending on what you're doing. And typically, a driving stint will be 2 hours in the car. And it's kind of interesting how things happen as a driver. About the first 30 minutes is the hardest part, believe it or not. And once you settle in, there's a rhythm to it that about half an hour in, it starts to seem like exercise, and you're going through the same thing over and over, and you're dealing with the same cars. You start to get very comfortable with the environment. Then about an hour in, your mind starts playing games on you, and the mental fatigue starts to set in, and you start to hear things in the car. The car starts to do things that you think are abnormal that maybe aren't. And the temptation is to sort of assume something's going wrong, that you need to pull in. That and I've done this before, where I just think there's no way this car is gonna make it, because you start hearing these noises, and you're imagining, as an engineer, your imagination can be very vivid about the sort of things that can be going wrong. And so you go ahead and imagine all these things, but then you finish 12 hours later and the car's great. So you can just see that had you given up, it would have been for nothing. And life is a lot like that. And so you spin, things happen. I remember one time I was at Road America, which is probably the fastest track in the U.S., and going through something called the carousel, which is this long sweeping curve at about 130 miles an hour. What's that, about 200 kilometers an hour? And I was in my Porsche, and it spun 180 degrees. And I just kept my foot in it and I got right back on track, didn't lose a single position. so it happened. So the other thing is that you have to be ready for being lucky. And this is really, really true. There's a lot of things that happen in life and you can view it as either luck or good luck or bad luck. And those who are ready for good luck see it. Those sometimes that aren't, it can just pass right under your nose and you don't even know it happened. And, I've had that in my life. The internet, I probably could have made a fortune on it. And I was an early user. I just never imagined that I could make money on the internet. I couldn't imagine how you would use this thing. It was mainly billboards connected together and people putting porn images out there and personal blogs and things like that. I couldn't imagine how you could turn this into billions of dollars. But here we are right now talking all over the world by Zoom. And it's an amazing thing. So the same is true in racing. Oftentimes when you're following people, you can end up with car spinning in front of you, and if you're not prepared that they may be getting weak or tired or whatever, you're not analyzing them, the spin may turn into a tragedy and you run into them, or it could be an opportunity to get past them. So that's the other one. And then I can't remember a lot of the other ones. Do you have any of those handy?
Keep your eyes on the end game.
Keep your eyes on the end game. Yes, you've got to. When you drive, if your car goes where the eyes go, and when you're looking at a corner and you're looking at where you want to put the car, it's called looking through the curve. That's where the car goes. And the same is true as if you get in an accident or a spin. If you look at the wall, that's exactly where you go. So when that example where I said I spun the car 180 degrees, I just kept looking down the track, and that's where the damn car went. And it's uncanny. And this is why, by the way, police on the side of the roads, at least in the United States, have laws that when they're out there on the side of the road with their lights flashing, particularly at night, you're supposed to go over one lane and give them a free lane of traffic. It's because people look at the police cars and literally they run into them because they're looking at them. So in life, this is the same thing. If you always think you're going to have failures, you probably will have a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so you have to keep looking down the road in life to say, where is it I want to be? And if you don't have an idea where it is you want to be, you're even in worse shape.
That's very inspiring, Jim. Thank you so much. Let me just repeat the 5 points that you put on your blog, and I will put for everybody the link to your blog in the description. It's quite short, but I think it's very inspiring. So the 5 things that you learned from racing, let me repeat, is preparation is fundamental, passion is key, never ever give up, which we talked about quite a lot in this podcast, keep your eyes on the end game, and the true champion has no ego.
There you go.
Yeah. We also want to talk about the future of space exploration / satellites, and how do you see it? There's this disruption of microsatellites in the business. Can you maybe give us a little bit of insight there?
Yeah, it's very interesting what's happening in the space business. There's a macro effect which has really been brought on by SpaceX and the success of SpaceX. So the idea, again, that private citizens and entrepreneurs can actually do these things that once only nation states did, open the floodgates to additional capital coming into the industry. And this is particularly true in the United States. And what this has allowed at the same time is this massive reduction in size of technology to be employed into the space industry. So you're seeing what amounts to an explosion in microsatellites coming about. And this explosion, not only in the number of them being produced and flown in space, they've gone from maybe 10 a year to, I think last year was about 380. I think we'll take a little breather this year because of the pandemic, but they're forecast to go up to about 1,000 a year here over the next few years. And I believe that'll still hold. None of the fundamentals have changed in the market. They've just delayed a little bit. So what you have then is also a number of groups that are building satellites that's exploded. It used to be much like, this issue of only governments did certain things Only very large corporations built satellites because they were esoteric, because they were complicated. They were built by about 6 or 7 organizations in the world, and now we have literally thousands of them. We have little tiny student groups in Lithuania building satellites, and you have students all over Germany building satellites, students all over the United States, plus professional organizations. So you can go out on the internet with your credit card and buy the parts to a satellite. You never could do that prior to about 5 years ago. So the supply chain has really come along. And what this means is the barrier to entry for doing things in space, for either exploring or, in my case, I prefer to think of it as commerce. Really, those barriers are coming down. And like the internet was 20 years ago, or probably more like 30 years ago in the 90s, we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what that space commerce is capable of. And like the internet, and I couldn't see how you would make money on it. A lot of people can't see how you would make money on space commerce. And really what it comes down to is there's 2 things that you can do particularly well in space. One is gather photons globally and turn them into decision quality information. So photons to bits and decisions. And then the second thing is moving bits from place to place on the Earth. It's still far more efficient to do that over the space channels than it is over terrestrial infrastructure. So the problem has been historically that the cost of the space infrastructure is much higher than the terrestrial infrastructure. And we're starting to see, with the supply chain coming down in price and availability going up, that's starting to change. So you'll see the information highway, in essence, expanding into space over the next 10 years. You'll see an expanded use of, I hate to use the word surveillance technologies, that's what it is, but Earth observation. And it can be used for observing other people's activities. It can be used for observing economic activity. It can be used for observing the Earth and its climate and how things are changing. So there's just a lot of things, particularly, that you can do with that particular set of data. And we're just very immature in that stage of that industry, very, very early on it. And Morgan Stanley predicts there's going to be a $2 trillion industry here by 2040. I tend to believe that.
That's crazy. Also, I saw in one of your Slush events that you talked about these microsatellites and these commercial, like the usual satellites, the ratio between the mass, what we usually have around 1,600 kilograms compared to 20 kilograms, and the development times and also the money, it's like enormously, there's a big difference. And as far as I remember, you also talked about the vector H and vector R, and that you basically have like a 1 magnitude of difference between 1.5 billion and only, quote unquote, 1.5 million for a rocket, which is basically nothing.
Right. Yeah, the cost of rockets are coming down. SpaceX has brought, the Falcon 9. The rest of the industry would charge 200 million for it, and they charge about 60. And they did that partly with reusability. And the reusability, you're not so much saving money not having to rebuild that stage. It's actually the logistics of building it in Los Angeles, transporting all the way across the United States. And if you've never been here, it's a very large country. It's a 3-day drive at least. And then, setting that new asset up there. Instead, they just fly it back and they refurbish it. So it turns out to be cheaper and easier and faster, more importantly, to refurbish that stage and reuse it so they can get their flight rates up. So they flew something like 30 flights last year, and that's been the highest of any major large size booster out there. So the costs of those have come down significantly. The small mass produced vehicles are really just beginning to come in on their own. And the idea there is it's like the Model T Ford back 100 years ago, that if you can mass produce these, you get what's called learning curve effects. So repetitive builds and so forth lower the cost, also increases the reliability. We know this because we all drive cars, at least most of us. And I can tell you the cars when I was in college are much inferior to the cars today in terms of reliability and quality. And we owe that to both technology and learning curve effects. And we're still spending, 30, 40,000 euros on a car that arguably, the first units would be hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you were to just build one of those cars. So it's same thing with rockets, that we can get the unit cost of the rocket down well below 60 million, because there's a different need for the small satellites than the big ones. And the big rockets like Falcon 9 are what you need as a minimum point to take people into space. And we watched last week or 2 weeks ago when SpaceX took the 2 astronauts up. And really, that's a minimum size rocket to do that. The Starship that they're working on, is really their people carrier, maybe also a cargo carrier, but that's really aimed at the people market and very large satellites. And the very large satellites will always be a part of the market because of the economics of going to geostationary orbit. But low Earth orbit will be inhabited by the micros. And there's a lot of reasons why that'll happen, but it's mainly to get the whole unit cost of getting a satellite into space down in the single digit millions of dollars. That's relatively easy to raise on the capital market. Some people have that kind of money in their bank account, and it's a lot easier to justify risk with that kind of capitalization than it is at $1 billion capitalization. So that's really the key right there, is that once you get this unit cost of getting something up there, the entrepreneurs can take risks, and meaning that new business models can be contemplated, new technologies can be incorporated, and new teams can be trusted, and new teams that learn. So you start to see how this starts to explode, and much like the computers did 30 years ago in the internet. And so that's really I think the thing that's going to happen. You'll see that this will follow the path of the internet and the microcomputer, and in some ways the car. I mean, the rocket industry is a lot like the car industry was 100 years ago, and there will be a lot of consolidation, but out of this will come a reliable space transportation system. And what we're starting to see right now is a number of companies that are vying to become those early, pioneers and hopefully the winners on the launch transportation system.
Mm-hmm. It's so cool that you mentioned the car industry back 100 years ago. I remember from one of your presentations that SpaceX is basically something like the Maserati static assembly station from the 1960s, where you have everything handmade and so on. And you back then were building basically rockets as an assembly line, so multiple rockets a year. Why is it, maybe to understand it better, why is it that SpaceX doesn't have to produce a massive amount of rockets? This is because of just the reproducibility or reusability?
No, it's just the size. I mean, you get it when you go into the factory and you look at the Falcon 9 first stages laying on the ground, and there's no room to move. And so to build a building where you could have an assembly line of these not only takes time and money, but it's a massive undertaking. So the result is what you see, which is reusability of those stages. And so it makes sense. And it's an esoteric difference I'm making with people, but in essence, they're not doing reusability for the pure sense of reusability. They're doing reusability to just offload that floor space on the factory floor to make more second stages, which are a lot more readily moved along in an assembly line. And SpaceX knows about assembly lines. If you look at their engines, they've got an assembly line of engines going out the door that's literally run by a BMW assembly manufacturing engineer that came over from England. So you talk to those guys, and they know how to mass produce engines. And for them, a rocket engine is no different than a car engine, just a little more complicated and a little more sensitive in a couple of places. And so that's what they've sought to do, was to use that floor space smartly. And the reusability thing also, and this is what I picked up on early, that's a Mars technology. So that's a technology that allows you to go to Mars, to land on Mars, and take off from Mars. So when you start to realize that a rocket, if you think of this as a transportation system, a rocket that can take off and land now becomes kind of ubiquitous. It can be used anywhere. It can be used on Mars, on the moon. What's a lunar lander? It's just a rocket that can land on the moon. And in principle, there's no difference between that and landing on the surface of the Earth. So it's no surprise that SpaceX is going into the business of lunar landers now. It's just an extension of that basic technology. So I think this is a good illustration of how Elon's mind works. From the very beginning, we said that the Falcon 1 had to be reusable. And Elon had this as sort of a religious belief in a way, that if we didn't reuse these stages, that there's no way we could make the money work out. And on the Falcon 1, this was really quite true, that it would definitely help. But Falcon 1 could have been mass produced as well. But he took the point of view that it was a cost thing. But as you look now, and nobody's told me this, but as my observations are, it's more of a logistical issue. Mm-hmm. And it's also a technology that becomes utilitarian across the board. And I think they realized that as time went on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jim, for this insight. I didn't know about every detail, but learned a lot now. Can you talk? It's maybe a broad question, but what is the biggest or the most difficult thing when you start building a rocket? I mean, there are a lot of difficult things, obviously, but what is the peak of the iceberg? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, the design's fairly easy, comparatively speaking. The engines are the hard part of the design to get them to work. They're not. The designs aren't deterministic, meaning that your analysis can say it ought to work, but it doesn't, because there's a lot of things you can't really model, like combustion and combustion efficiency and stability and things like that. So you find the rocket engines are really the expensive, time-consuming, and non-deterministic part. That was one of the things we had trouble with at Vector, was our rocket engines. They were so simple, yes, but the performance was not consistent from engine to engine. We could produce 5 or 10 engines, and maybe 3 of them performed the way we wanted and 7 didn't. So understanding what the processes were in the manufacturing that led to that difference, and in some cases it wasn't manufacturing processes, but variations in the materials that went into it that caused those differences. That's what was very difficult for us. So all these engines are difficult. They get easier, with technology that's come along. Our modeling abilities have gotten better with time. But once you get that done and down, the rest of it is really about operations and being able to fuel these things and to get them to fly and dealing with the regulatory environment. That's really the tough part. And it has to be very, very reliable, because if anything goes wrong, you usually don't have enough margin in anything to survive, some failures.
Mm-hmm, got it. Obviously, you went through a lot of stages in the rocket industry, starting very early in Paris, as far as I remember, as a young engineer, just graduating from high school. If someone wants to go the same path as you did, what would you recommend to them?
Well, my path was a little unusual, going, for the French Space Agency and then working with a Soviet mission to Mars and so on. That was lucky, and I was prepared for that luck. As it presented itself to me, I jumped on it. But, if you want to get into this business, you've just got to start doing it. You need the education, the pedigree, if you will, in engineering somewhere. Not everybody in the business, however, is engineering degrees and even degrees. I know a lot of people who never got a degree, and that's fine. My opinion on education is that it's not necessarily something you learn with, but it's, you learn to learn independently. So you really, the easiest way is to go to university, get an engineering degree, and just start being involved. And it's a lot like, it's a lot like auto racing. When I switched over to road racing about 20 years ago, I didn't know anybody in the business. So I just started going to the racetracks, and I started talking to people, and I started understanding, who the players were, what the issues were. And little by little, I got involved. And you have to kind of do the same thing. And in this business. And startups are a great place to start because startups are what we call jack of all trades. When you come in, you end up doing a little bit of everything, which I've always liked. It's kind of poisoned me for life, because if I go to a big company, I get bored. Big companies aren't necessarily the right place to start, although not a bad place to start. Depends on your personality. But these startups, I work with a lot of young people. I just started another company called Phantom Space, and we like the young ones. We like them out of not high school, but college, and we like them, where they're energetic. They're usually a lot more energetic than I am at my age, and it's fun to watch them grow. And you'll find that people like me, there's a lot of people like me that'll want to mentor you. We yearn to pass along what we know to people who are enthusiastic and want to do it. So, you don't have to go to work for a space agency. You don't have to necessarily go to work for SpaceX. Get involved in startups, and it doesn't matter if you get started in satellites or rockets. It's all kind of the same. And once you get inside the world, it's a very small world. I joke that there's 342 people in the space business, but at times it feels like that because I can go to a conference and know almost everybody there. You can't say that for, say, the automotive industry worldwide. It's a very big industry, but space is still very small, and you can come in and make a real difference.
Obviously, it's not possible for everybody to work at SpaceX because of the some regulations. Would it be possible theoretically to work at Phantom Space, like for a German, for example?
Well, I would love that very much. My wife is German, but she's also a U.S. citizen. But the problem we have in this country is our regulations require somebody to be either a resident or a U.S. citizen. And so one of the ways to get that residency is to come to universities in the U.S. You get a student visa, and then that allows them to come work for us. We don't have a personal bias against the Europeans or others. It's really our government has these crazy laws that have some basis in reality, but they tend to be crazy all the same.
If people want to reach out to you, how can they do that, Jim?
Yeah, probably the best way to do is through my website, jimcantrell.com. And you can send an inquiry in there. I do actually answer those. So I get a lot of press inquiries and so forth. And students occasionally reach me there, or LinkedIn.
Awesome. First of all, I want to close this phenomenal podcast with you, Jim. And I again want to quote Garth Stein from his novel, which I mentioned in the early beginning. So let me just continue. To be a champion, you must have no ego at all. You must not exist as a separate entity. You must give yourself over to the race. You are nothing if not for your team, your car, your shoes, and your tires. Do not mistake confidence and self-awareness for egotism. So, Jim Cantrell, thanks a lot for making us dream and giving us inspiration.
My pleasure.